The best presenter for now to keep you awake. Some words about Yanis. He is professor at Athens University of Economics and Business. He has experience as a practitioner before in PricewaterhouseCoopers in Greece, and also as head of the training in a bank with a Greek name, so I'm trying to avoid the name. He has published a lot of research on several international peer-reviewed journals, and he also has been part of the executive committee of Europe. I think you finished, some years ago. He is also a member of Academy of Management, Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and he is also one of the co-founders of the European Network of Selection Researchers, and also since 2017 is a member of Represent Greece in this network in ENOP, European Network of Organizational Psychologists. And he's also co-founder of an NGO Job Pairs that is supporting young graduates through mentoring, which I think is a really interesting initiative. And with this diverse and complete profile, he's going to talk today about something that I know some of you are waiting, is selection and technology in recruitment and selection. Where are we now and where are we going? Let's see if we can find some answer. Welcome, Yanis.
Okay, thanks Alfredo for this very nice introduction. Thank you all for still being here. I'll try my best to keep you awake. I know it's after lunch, after a siesta, although I just found out that siesta does not exist in Spain, it's a myth. So what we are going to talk about within the next 50 minutes or so will be about the role of technology in recruitment and selection. I'm used to give a lot of presentations in practitioners talking about this topic, so I'll try to combine here the theoretical, the research perspective, since we are in an academic conference meeting with a practitioner's perspective, because this is it's a topic that it's of very high interest for practitioners, both in Greece and elsewhere. It's probably one of the topics where technology has really made an impact on how we recruit and select people. So you probably know that this is what we call the recruitment cycle in recruitment and selection. So I've based my presentation across those 4 stages. Very briefly, we first recruit people. I will try to attract as many candidates or as a number of qualified candidates for the position we are interested to fill in. Then in the next stage, we do some screening on a number of those candidates. We try to find, for example, additional information about them, or we put some testing in place to measure for a few of them a number of skills and competencies we are interested in. And then in the third stage of selection, we actually implement the most, one would say, expensive selection methods that we can use for a number of shortlisted applicants, for example, assessment centers or interviewing, in order to make a final decision. What's of interest for me as well, because this is a major part of my own research agenda, is what happens after both the candidates, when they are rejected, for example, or what happens after when the candidates become employees. It's what we call the day after. So we'll talk about those 4 different parts of the recruitment cycle and how technology has affected each one of those, avoiding to repeat the traditional, for example, selection methods, but we will only focus on those most important parts of the recruitment cycle where technology seems to have a major impact. So we'll start with that. Then we'll talk about the most critical issues and a few theoretical considerations which should take into account across those four different parts of the recruitment cycle. And also I will provide a few ideas for future research for those of you that might be interested in how technology can be effective and can be used in relation to this recruitment cycle. So starting with recruitment, these are the three things that we'll cover. A few of them are already, probably you are already familiar. For example, as job seekers. So we'll talk briefly about internet-based recruitment. And we'll talk about a few more recent developments in the field like ATS, applicant tracking systems, and video CVs. So starting from the internet-based recruitment, we are all pretty familiar now with the typical process that most companies follow when they advertise a job opening. For example, by advertising the job on their websites or advertising their openings in job boards, i.e. specialized career sites, which can be used, for example, as aggregators from different websites, company websites, in order to combine, for example, a number of different job ads within one particular website. The technology has affected a lot how companies, for example, advertise their job openings on their own company career sites. For example, technology has helped us a lot in order to increase how we trace applicants while they visit, for example, a company website, in order to make sure, for example, that we keep following them, or, for example, to make sure that the HR people of the company might be able to connect with them on LinkedIn and, for example, persuade them or increase their awareness of their company or potential job openings in the future. We also see an enriched content from traditional career sites where a company would simply just put a job ad. Now they can combine it, for example, with information from social media in order to make it more interactive for candidates, but also to make it more useful for the companies in order to attract more information about the job applicants. Now, job boards, sites such as Career Builder or Monster.com, and in different countries there are specialized job boards for particular countries. They are still perceived in the time of social media as one of the most effective ways of attracting candidates and for candidates to apply for jobs. In a study we conducted in 2014 in Greece, we saw that candidates only 4 years ago, they still trusted more the well-established job boards as opposed, for example, to social networking websites such as the LinkedIn. What we see is that even there, as it is the case for company career sites, job boards can become more interactive in the same way, for example, combining candidates' information from other media such as LinkedIn. Where social networking websites, you all know about it, it's a whole new world, so I think it's worth telling a few more things about how it has changed the era, and it's probably one of the most major, if not the most major, technological development in the field of recruitment. The most useful way of using social media for recruiters, for example, is that it now gives opportunity to do what we call poaching, i.e. to follow up and, in some cases, aggressively recruit candidates who are not really interested in applying for a job, but since they are there, they are considered what we call passive candidates, and in a cheap and a very effective way, recruiters can follow up and try to convince them about applying for a job. I'm sure many of you already, I'm sure many more in the future, will receive, for example, job offers or job opportunities, not job offers immediately, about, for example, applying in a position that seems to fit well with your LinkedIn profile. I pretty much don't know any recruiter nowadays who doesn't use LinkedIn almost excessively. It's been used almost full time. It's very cheap, and it's also used very much. It's used a lot by job seekers. I mean, for many countries, Greece included, despite the crisis, it's almost impossible for a job seeker to look for a job without an active LinkedIn profile, for example. However, as far as research is concerned, it's a typical example where practice has moved much faster, and we still lag behind of how and what is the most effective way of using LinkedIn, and what are the issues involved with the use, for example, of social media in job seeking and recruitment and selection. A more recent development, which is very beneficial for companies, what we call applicant tracking systems. Applicant tracking systems are cloud-based applications which manage the whole administration of the recruitment process. So an individual can apply online on a company career site, and the applicant tracking system behind the company career site can follow up, run, execute, and the recruiter can effectively manage the whole application process. It can be connected with job boards, social media, online application forms, and moreover, I think the major advantage of ATS, and I use here an example of a Greek startup which specializes on that, although it's only started like 2 or 3 years ago, it's now very effective. It's how you can combine rich data from different sources about your candidates, combining information that they provide, for example, when they fill in an application form, or with information that you can find about your candidates from their different social media profiles, such as LinkedIn, Twitter, or even more personalized social media, such as Facebook. And it's also a very nice way to use and effectively use HR metrics to accurately assess how well you are doing in your recruitment and selection process. For example, your success rates, your time to hire, etc. A relatively recent development in the field of recruitment about the different recruitment methods that they've existed already, but it's now a more recent one, is what we call video CVs and video resumes. You know the traditional CV, the candidate completes his information and sends it to candidates within 1 or 2 pages. The difference now is that the candidates are required to present themselves in a video recorded message and send that to companies. It's in some countries it might replace traditional resumes. It's a very good way of assessing, it can be a very good way of assessing candidates' communication skills. But especially in countries such as Belgium, in the Netherlands, where it's one of those countries, it's something that our colleagues have studied a lot, how video CVs are being used in recruitment and selection. There are major issues that have to do with discrimination, diversity, and also something that we haven't explored is whether it's actually how equivalent it is with traditional, for example, CVs. Moving on to the next step of screening. The 4 things that we'll talk about now. Imagine now that we are talking about a smaller number of candidates that have moved on from the recruitment to the next phase. The first part of resume storage, parsing, and keyword. Here we describe a concept where companies can combine the information about the candidates that they request as part of the application, of their job application process, in combination with any other relevant info that they can find about their candidates from other sources, especially social media. This is a very good application of what we call big data in employee recruitment and selection, because you can combine all this information, make effective resume management, and by using resume parsing tools, keyword search, you can find lots of information about large number of candidates, gathering this information from totally different sources. Data mining techniques and machine translation technologies are used here a lot. This is something that's really very new for the field of recruitment and selection, because also it requires access to all this information. It raises a lot of issues, obviously, that have to do with the ethical and secure use of this information and the consensus of applicants for the provision of this information. In the recruitment selection process, we knew for many years that a very effective tool of gathering information about from our candidates, maybe very often even replacing the traditional CV is via online application blanks, and more recently the online application blanks. In selection research, we have even explored the validity of weighted application blanks. In other words, an online application where the information that the candidates provide is scored in a way, so you come up with a score about your candidates based, for example, on their work experience, on the quality of the school they have received education, potential licenses that they have received. So candidates provide all this information in a measurable and in a quantifiable way. So you evaluate, you rank order your candidates based on their information, and in combination with what we described earlier about resume storage and parsing, you can combine all this information that they provide online with candidates' social media profiles. Social media is also used a lot in the screening process. Now, what we mean here is that we already know the candidate. For example, we have his CV in front of us, or we might even have his online application completed. Let's Google him. What we often do with people that we first met. Let's find out more information about him here on LinkedIn or on Facebook. Whereas in the previous stage, the use of LinkedIn meant that, okay, I have a job profile on my mind. Let's find out suitable candidates. Here, I already know a number of candidates. Let's try to find out additional information about them above and beyond of the information that possibly they have already provided to us. That's a very sensitive issue for us recruiters. I remember when I started doing this kind of research in 2004, 2005, there were a very blurred picture of how and why and if we should use, for example, Facebook on when we screen and when we gather information about applicants. And this wasn't the case only in Europe. This was even the case in the US, where very sensitive also about how you use additional information from other sources, in many cases without the consensus of the candidates. So there are major ethical privacy concerns. Again, very limited information of how actually recruiters are influenced from the information they find about the candidates on social media. Now we have already started a project back in Greece to find out what is the major negative information that, for example, influences recruiters' perception on when they check a LinkedIn profile? Is it, for example, the limited information, or is it the fact that they see something that they don't like on the candidate's LinkedIn profile photo, for instance? So this is something we really lack, and because of the heavy usage of LinkedIn, especially for screening, it's very important to find out, and it's really very important to know. It's also a part of the recruitment process where we use extensively what we call social media analytics and web scraping. I'll describe now what I'm referring to here. For example, there is some research that has demonstrated, you've mentioned it this morning, that via Facebook activity and the number of likes or dislikes, or even the number of demographic characteristics, you can relate the number of likes and dislikes, for example, with a number of demographic, personality, or even cognitive ability variables. This is something that it's really new, and this is something that we really need more research on that, because most of these studies that also Alfredo mentioned this morning are data-driven approaches. So we see IT guys having access to huge piles of data and not really knowing how to handle all this kind of information. And instead of following, as we always suggest, a theory-driven approach to find out how, for example, specific aspects of likes you do or dislikes on Facebook are related, and why, for example, to aspects of personality, they do go the other way around in order to find out relationships between and within the data. The question for recruiters and for research is whether they really add any real value above and beyond existing methods. For example, maybe I should have said that from the beginning, in recruitment selection we know that some methods work and others do not. We know, for example, that a very efficient way of assessing people in a selection process is by measuring simple IQ, simply cognitive ability, using a valid IQ test, and possibly conscientiousness, or possibly with a combination of a work sample test. So the basic idea is whether all this kind of information can be used in order to predict something above and beyond the existing methods, and I'll talk about that later on again. For example, when we talk about web scraping and linguistic analysis, there are companies that have invested a lot on and providing expensive services to companies in order to use this information. If you have Twitter, spend some time to Google and find out IBM Watson personality insights. That's a free tool where you can either put a body of text describing yourself, or you just can link your Twitter account and what IBM Watson, and this is what artificial intelligence does basically without the interference of a live person, is that it evaluates your personality based on your Twitter account. And I did that earlier this morning, and it describes that according to the big 5 dimensions and compared to yeah, and I'll show you my full profile later on. I'm more likely to do some kind of this stuff, and less likely to do something like that. It's quite accurate. I wouldn't say that it's 100% accurate, because, for example, later on, it shows that I'm very low in agreeableness, where many of our colleagues know that I'm a really nice person. But actually, on Twitter, I'm heavily criticizing our government, so very often, and I think I should do so, but that's why apparently I came up as very low in agreeableness. Other than that, my wife would definitely agree that I'm relatively low in openness, and she proposes that's a very good thing for being a husband. Husbands shouldn't be high in openness. And the truth is that this is the case about emotional stability and conscience. So this is pretty accurate. So coming back to how these things will be used, think about this morning's presentation by Alfredo. Here we talk about gathering and analyzing information about people based on artificial intelligence without anyone assessing this kind of information, simply on what you say, on what you share on Twitter, or how you describe yourself. Here, for example, you can do it by putting a document about yourself, describing yourself, and you can see the results. So this is, again, something that we'll see more in the future, but obviously it requires heavy research in order to explore whether it actually works and if there is enough evidence for companies to use them, not only in an effective way, but also, and that's really important for us, doing research in recruitment selection, doing it in an ethical way and in a legal way as well. In the next stage of selection, these are the main 4 issues now that we've been studying the last few years. I'll start with digital interviewing and voice profiling. I think this is something that the last couple of years has attracted a lot of attention. I was last year in the annual SIOP Congress in the States, and there were a few sessions that really attracted large audiences. One of them was digital interviewing, and the other one was gamification and games-based assessment. Now, when we talk about digital interviewing, we do not talk about, it's not about Skype interview, it's not about video conferencing. Digital interview, as you might have heard, has to do with a video recorded interview where the candidates respond to questions that they were provided. For example, they received those questions via email, or even better, they can see an interviewer, not live, they can watch an interviewer putting up some questions, and often they are given time to practice, and then they record their response, and the response goes back to the employer. Now, we all know that interview can be a very expensive selection process. You cannot go into lengthy interviews or have a valid semi-structured interview as the best practice suggests, for all your applicants. Okay, and that's why in most cases we spend and do most of our heavy interviewing during the last stages of the selection process only to the shortlisted applicants. The main difference here is that companies have the opportunity to interview as many people as possible this way, because companies' interviewers are not involved, so they can evaluate a number of key characteristics which might often do, for example, in a phone interview, in a screening interview at the beginning of the selection process, but still with a limited number of people. You can, for example, here you can use this with all the people who have applied and sent their CVs or have completed an online application form, okay, because it doesn't require any resources from the company's perspective. Obviously, a major limitation, and it's one of the reasons why, as we'll discuss later on, it's not well taken from candidates. Candidates seem to hate it, is that it lacks the personal interaction that applicants enjoy with the interview. In a study we've conducted a few years ago, we saw that the two things that applicants really enjoy during an interview, although and it's the main reason why they prefer the employment interview as opposed to any other kind of objective assessment methods, because interview is not the most objective selection method. On the contrary, we would say, we have studied for many, many years the biases, the stereotypes that exist in the employment interview. Despite that, candidates really want to and really enjoy being interviewed because they have the opportunity and they have the perception that they can influence the selection process. They enjoy the personableness, the ability to come in face-to-face with the interviewer. And they also enjoy the fact that they can ask questions and gather information about the job or the company from the recruiter, what we call informativeness. So this is something that they really enjoy in the face-to-face interview, even the Skype interview, but this is really something that we lack in the digital interviewing, and it's one of the reasons that applicants don't like it. However, the technology has now helped us, and there are many companies in the other part of in the US mostly, that what they do with this kind of digital interviews is that they apply text analytics and voice mining techniques. So they try to link not only what you say, but also how you say it, or even try to use algorithmic reading of voice-generated emotions. We all know, for example, in the psychology field, many of us are pretty familiar with Paul Ekman's work on emotional recognition and micro-expressions. So many of those companies try to apply all this in a digital interviewing. So one of the major companies in the US say that for each interview, for each digital interview with a candidate, at the end of the day, you might end up with thousands, if not millions, of, as they call it in big data points. Data points means information per candidate. They don't really know what are these data points. They do not really know about anything, or very rarely they know what's the construct validity of those data points, but they have lots of information and they play around with all this kind of information. So this is something that it would be almost impossible to have in a face-to-face interview. But this is something that we'll see even more in the future because it provides lots of data and lots of information and the ability to companies, and also the ability to companies to watch and receive more information about their candidates via this digital interviewing, as opposed to face-to-face interview. Psychometric assessment has always been a very effective and widely used selection method for many years. Technology, ever since before the big data era and before the internet era, has helped a lot the development of psychological assessment. In the pretty old years when we started using psychological tests in selection, we had to ask candidates to come all together at the same time in a venue in order to make sure that we follow the same process, that they all face the same identical tasks, and in order to avoid, for example, cheating. So it was almost impossible to use psychometric assessment at the early stages of the recruitment selection process. You couldn't do it. How many people could you evaluate via, for example, an IQ test or a personality test? The cost was very high for companies. Now, ever since the internet era, we've moved into online testing. So this is something that has been widely used and still used a lot. Very often now companies use online testing instead of the shortlisted applicants earlier in the process, exactly because it's cheaper and they can use it with large number of applicants. There are still concerns over security conditions and administration. For example, in high-stakes selection, when we talk about an important job to fill, companies might ask candidates to, I recall at least one multinational company which asks candidates to complete a similar psychometric test at their premises after they have already completed online. A major development in the field that we will talk later on when we talk about psychometric assessment has to do with gamification and games-based assessment. And another major development on online testing is the use of new theoretical approaches on developing new psychological tests, such as item response theory. Also, the ability of having access to huge data sets of people completing those assessments, as opposed to how it was the case a few years ago, also gives us the opportunity for new and different data analytic techniques in developing and adapting or even adjusting traditional psychometric tests. So in the online testing, a major issue was whether we use a proctored versus an unproctored approach. For example, as I said before, for high-stakes selection, you have to make sure that actually the candidate who fulfills a psychometric questionnaire does it alone, without any assistance, or without Googling the answers, or that he or she even is herself that actually does the test. Now, technology has helped us a lot in order to make sure, for example, that in an proctored testing environment, i.e. without invigilation, when, for example, the candidate completes the assessment at home in his own time, technology has helped us a lot here in order to make sure that, for example, he's the person that does it. For example, there's a US startup that can identify if you are actually yourself typing in a word processor, similarly to how we use, for example, our finger in order to find out whether, as a personal identification. So they analyze your typing habits, and then when the time comes to complete a test, they make sure that it's actually you when you complete the test, because it's the same, you follow the same pattern or the same ways of typing in using the keyboard. Or other techniques where, for example, when you complete an online assessment, you do not have access anywhere else on your computer, but only to the environment of the test itself. In general, proctor testing and especially electronic performance monitoring is something that candidates do not really like. They do not like that they might be perceived as not being trustworthy. And it also, as it is the case for many other selection methods, it lacks the ability to interact in face-to-face with your assessors. A recent development, when we talk about new selection methods, which has also attracted a lot of my attention in research and practice the last 2 years, is the concept of gamification and games-based assessment. Here are a few principles that made a lot of people starting up their own companies, for example, in this field. If I ask how many of you play any kind of game, many hands will be raised. There are many people that, and when we talk about game, we don't necessarily talk about a PlayStation or an Xbox. Any kind of game, for example, on our mobile while we are waiting on the bus or while we are on the metro. So many, and it's not only guys, also lots of women. Most studies have shown that it's mostly women that tend to play this even simple games on Facebook or on our mobiles as opposed to males. The idea behind it is that it gives the opportunity for candidates to demonstrate their skills, for example, in a games-based assessment, and for instance, and this is something that we'll see in the future, advertise it on their CVs or on their LinkedIn profile, similarly to what we do with a very high GMAT score, or similarly to what we do with our very high GPA, and we make sure that we put it on our CV. So moving on from a push to a pull model, where, for example, the recruiters will be able to check the highest scorers on a specific game and invite for an interview only those, for example. It also gives the opportunity, although this is the case for most online assessments, for immediate personalized feedback. So once you play a game and you complete it, you receive a personal feedback profile. And it can be used, although this is something really new and it's still in development both in Europe and the US, it can be used, or we'll see in the future, if this is really the case, to assess different kinds of skills, both soft skills, hard skills, cognitive skills, personality or interests. In Greece, I'm heavily involved with a small startup company called Wiwi, which we use a different approach compared to how it's most games-based assessment is being used. So instead of building a game, gathering the data of this game from our applicants and then check how well they perform without really knowing, for instance, the validity or the construct or the content validity of the game, which unfortunately, this is very often the case in this industry. We followed what we call SJT methodology, situational judgment test. I didn't talk about this because SJT is not really a new selection method. You all know situational interviewing, the SJT, so instead of asking the candidates how they would react in a situation, they are presented with the situation and they are also presented with the different options they might have in a multiple choice format. So it's an objective assessment, so it can be considered even a psychometric assessment, and we always evaluate something behind them. We do not just ask a scenario without really knowing what's the skill or the competency behind those. So what we did with our colleagues in Greece, we developed a number of scenarios assessing soft skills, and we have explored what we should always do in this kind of new assessments: reliability, construct validity, criterion-related validity, and how applicants perceive them. We've presented this work. We are now in process of publishing. The best thing about Wiwi is that it's free for candidates to complete. So yourselves, for example, can visit their website and play the game, which is not an actual game. It's a role playing. You take the role of a person and you face different situations and you react to those situations. And the outcome of this game is at its current form, is to evaluate 4 basic soft skills that we have identified that most recruiters tend to seek out among graduates: adaptability, resilience, flexibility, and decision-making. This is one type of gamification and games-based assessment. Another type, which is also very widely used, is what we call cognitive-based assessment, or mini-mind games, where you play brief, quick games on your mobile, which has initial evidence of construct validity of what they actually measure and how accurately they do. They are perceived very positively from applicants. For example, I'm involved in such a project now with Arctic Source, which is a technology firm in the UK specialized on mini-mind games, in order to explore applicant reactions. So drop me a line if you want to participate, because this kind of game is not free, so you cannot really find out and play the game out there, as opposed to a Wiwi, unless you are a candidate in a selection process. So there are different types of games out there, but when we talk about selection methods, the principles should always be there, the ones that you learn ever since your first year in psychology: reliability, validity, and different types of validity. I'll get back to this issue later on. Organizations have demonstrated increased interest on games-based assessment and gamification. Alfredo this morning talked about Generation Y. Exactly, companies are interested on this new kind of assessment because younger generations tend to get bored on filling in traditional psychometric tests. They also tend to get bored easily when they have to spend a lot of time on, for example, responding in a situational judgment test. So they try to find new ways of doing that, also for the benefit of the organization in terms of administration and in terms of economic resources. So I'm not saying that it's the best new selection method, but it's something that exactly because it has received increased attention from companies, and applicants also seem to enjoy playing those kind of games. It's something that we should study more. It's something that we should investigate more from a research point of view. So you can see a few of the benefits here. I'm not going to get into detail. And I'll talk now about the last part of the recruitment selection cycle, which has to do with the day after. Now, I've been doing a lot of research on applicant reactions. Very simple, how applicants perceive a company, how applicants perceive the recruitment and the selection process of the company, and whether this really matters. Okay, you might have a negative experience with an employer as a job seeker. There are many people. For example, I have never bought a product from a specific company that didn't treat me well while I was looking for a job. So this is something that has recently attracted a lot of attention. From a research point of view, small but sizable effects on job performance. So there is a small effect for candidates who perceive positively the recruitment selection process of a company and how they actually perform once they are inside the organization. But there are stronger effects on the applicants, both rejected and successful candidates, on employee attitudes and especially organizational attractiveness. So exactly because of technology, and because of the different means that candidates have in order to share their experiences. Many of you might know Glassdoor.com, a website where people can join in order to share how companies treated them while they were candidates, or even how companies treat them as employees. So most job seekers nowadays, before they go to an interview, they visit Glassdoor to find out more information about those companies. And companies, at least serious companies, should be interested in that, because you don't want your rejected candidates to tell bad things about you, although they were rejected. And you certainly don't want your current employees or your past employees to share negative experiences about you as an employer, because this is a way of in reducing organizational attractiveness, and even in countries such as Greece, with an unemployment rate of 20–25%, there are specific professions, specific jobs, which are really hard for companies to fill in. So this is something that we should be interested in. I'm involved, for example, and this is something that we'll start analyzing soon with huge data set, I would call it big data, of the whole Glassdoor reviews of companies, how employees and applicants write on Glassdoor, and how they actually evaluate the attractiveness of the company, whether they would recommend the company to other candidates, etc. So this is something that we'll see more and more in the future, as it is the case for employer branding, i.e. branding. We'll talk more about this, and applicant reactions are directly related to employer branding, and contrary to what was the case in the past, where if you had a bad experience with a company, you could only share it with your friends. Now it's much more easier to share all this information and really make an impact very often. So how technology has affected applicant reactions. For example, we should explore how applicants perceive those new methods. We should also explore how applicants perceive the new modes of delivery of existing predictor methods. For example, you might try to evaluate Big Five instead of using a traditional personality questionnaire via a game, via gamification, or via an online SJT. How applicants perceive this, and also a major line of research that will be that we'll see even more in the future is the interaction between applicant reactions and social networking websites, both from the applicant's perspective and from the company's perspective. In order to find out what's the impact of all those new methods or new modes of delivery to applicants' attitudes, outcomes, especially compared to traditional methods. In order to respond to a question, does it worth using these new predictor methods from an applicant reactions perspective, at least? In a study we very recently completed in Greece, we asked people to evaluate what we call the process favorability using a scale from 1 to 7, the new technology, as we call them, the new technology-oriented methods. And you can see here, as we discussed earlier on, that one of the methods that received the most negative reactions from the candidate's perspective is digital interviewing and personal social networking websites. Nobody likes being screened on what he says on Facebook or Instagram or any other personal social networking profiles. So whereas in the study that we did in Greece 10 years ago, interview was the most positively regarded selection method, as is the case for example. This is the case still for online interviews, for example Skype, because it provides the face-to-face opportunity, the opportunity for face-to-face interaction with the interviewer. But on the contrary, on the other end, digital interviewing and personal and social networking websites very, very low in applicants' process favorability. Onboarding as part of the day after, onboarding and socialization, i.e. the effectiveness, the effective introduction of our employees, of our newly recruited employees in the company. Companies use different tools, especially for younger generation, in order to help them introduce themselves and fit in with the organization and the job as quickly as possible. An example I give here is is the example of Yammer. Because we are so accustomed of using Facebook or any other social media, companies develop company-specific social networking websites. So if you work for a company like IKEA, for instance, this is the case in Greece, I guess it's elsewhere as well, you have your own Facebook within IKEA. So, for example, Microsoft has developed Yammer, which is only accessible to current employees within the company's premises, within the company's computers, or with when you log in from outside with your own credentials. And you can do the same stuff that you do, for example, on Facebook or on LinkedIn, but only now you can do it within your own intranet-based social networking websites. Companies use many other means. I'm not going to get into details on new applications that they use in order for newly recruited employees to familiarize with the new company that they are recruited, or videos or e-mentoring. Many of this stuff has been around in different formats in the past. What has attracted also a lot of attention in the selection field the last few years is employer branding. Branding is not a new concept, it comes from marketing, but exactly because we are interested in the image of the company to both insiders and outsiders, this is something we have explored and we will even explore more in the future, especially in relationship to applicant reactions and social media. An interesting line of work from colleagues in Belgium is the exploration and the distinction between the traditional word of mouth and what we call e-word of mouth or word of mouth. So comparing and contrasting what we did in the past, i.e. to share the information with friends and relatives in the word of mouth format, as opposed to how we do it, for example, now via Glassdoor or via social media, and how this word of mouth has different impact depending we are talking about a positive word of mouth or a negative word of mouth. Companies dislike negative word of mouth, but we have only recently started exploring the differential impact of those two. And I'm pretty sure that as it is the case in Greece, it's the same in Spain and other countries as well. This is something that employers really value. you all know all those competitions that are around, although that there is plenty of evidence that they do not really have an actual real impact on both organizational attractiveness or whether they actually are associated with actual organizational outcomes. So there is a lot of buzz out there about best employers, etc., that we should investigate, especially in relation with technology. We've all heard about big data already. I think that as psychologists have a major advantage compared to other people because for a major part of big data is how effective and good we are with statistics. It's as simple as that. Although we use in psychology, we've been taught, we learned statistics from very early on. This is an important basis in order to introduce yourselves with big data. Alfredo this morning proposed that if you're going to get acquainted with big data, try to gather more courses from even other departments. Yes, it requires additional knowledge, but we have a strong basis from our basic statistics and methodology courses that we take earlier on, contrary to other areas or other studies. So big data, it's not just HR metrics, it's a combination of using advanced statistical methods with business data and combining this information, but following a theoretically driven approach, not just analyzing data and trying to find out what the data looks like. I have put some information here. There are so many data out there you can combine about your current employees, especially combining them with external data of them from other sources. And a few more things. I know that I'm pretty close, almost. Yep. I would like to cover a few critical issues that we should take into consideration. We always start from ethics. It's not a coincidence that from your first year in your psychology studies, you hear a lot about ethics. And it's even more important nowadays with the huge amount of data that one can find about you out there. Major legal considerations, major data privacy issues, data protection issues, and test security. From a test development perspective, we have to make sure that we accurately, reliably, and validly evaluate, assess the constructs we are interested in, and whether they are equivalent with established measures, in simple words, the construct validity of the measures. In selection, a major issue is the bandwidth fidelity dilemma. Do we use broad or narrowly defined constructs? That's a major distinction. There isn't a right or wrong answer whether we should follow the former or the latter. There are, however, many different methods that follow either or approach. So it's the same about new technology-oriented methods. Major administration and implementation issues that are related with cost development. These things are all very expensive. They are not easy to, especially to develop, not to buy as a product. We should pay special attention in a proctor assessment in high-stakes selection, especially in this area of high-risk selection, and a major distinction between constructs that we know that work already versus new predictor methods that we might not clearly know what exactly they measure. And we should never forget the basics. Okay, we should never forget the concepts, as I've said, of reliability and validity, even to new methods, or even to new modes of delivering of existing valid predictor constructs, such as personality and intelligence. In selection, we know after many years of research that some things work and some things do not work. So those new methods, they have to provide evidence that they work above and beyond existing methods in order to justify their usefulness and in many cases the investment. I'll skip the major theories that we use when we explore those constructs. They are well-established psychological theories that exist out there for many, many years. I'll keep a note only of deotic outrage. This is an interesting theory that explores the impact of mistreatment not to the applicants themselves, but to others. So how you perceive the selection process that a friend of yours has gone through, and how you perceive then the company without being a candidate to this company, but how you perceive this company by gathering information from the people you trust, from your friends or from your Facebook friends, for example. So the things that we read out there in social media and how this has an impact on our own intentions to apply for a job, for instance. Here are a few ideas for future research, and I'll finish. Big data is something that will attract more attention research-wise in the future. The same is about social media. There is still very limited research on social networking websites about all aspects of recruitment and selection, how technology and social media interact with branding, for example, positive, negative, word of mouth, whether those new methods or new modes of delivery, existing constructs, actually really work and whether it's worth spending money on it. And in terms of applicant reactions, we know, for example, that across all countries, there are some methods that people like, interviews and work samples, and others that they don't like, graphology, for instance, or personal references. We should do the same about technology-oriented selection methods. So, the future is here. Vast data pools and improved analytical capabilities will disrupt the talent identification process. We have many more talent signals, i.e. we have many more information, or we can have access to many more information about our candidates from different sources. And there are more new tools that we can use in order to gather this information, not necessarily to analyze, but certainly to gather this information via increased computing power. However, there is still limited validated evidence compared to old school methods, compared to traditional selection methods that were always around and we know that they work. Major privacy and anonymity concerns. There is a trade-off that organizations should take into consideration between development costs and accuracy, validity, and user experience, especially for the new technology-oriented methods that require heavy investment in developing them. And also very limited, if any, research on adverse impact and unfair discrimination issues in regards to these new methods. We live our lives online, and so do recruiters, but valid evidence-based tools and methodologies are required in order to take fair and just hiring decisions. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for two questions, one online and one from the audience. The online question is whether you think that personality assessments based on social media are just confounded by frequency of activity.
By?
Frequency of activity.
By privacy?
Frequency of activity.
Frequency of activity. Yeah, as you've said this morning, the more likes you have, for example, the more information you have about candidates. And this is something that we haven't studied, for example, not having a Facebook profile, obviously. And more importantly, not having a LinkedIn profile. This doesn't mean that a candidate is not suitable for a specific position. However, there are companies that do that. They say that if I cannot find the candidate, I'm a technology-oriented company, so if a candidate is not out there, then he's not suitable for us. If he cannot present himself on LinkedIn, I don't want him here. So obviously, yeah, the more information you have about a candidate, the more you can analyze, for example, via big data or any other selection, advanced statistical techniques about their personality or any other kind of skills. As I said before, those approaches very often are not theory-driven, they are data-driven. So the more data you have about people, for example, about a number of people on Facebook, the easier the assumption it is that you can combine this information and about their, for example, personality profiles without asking them to complete the personality profile, obviously. Yeah.
And I will add to this that the information that people are sharing online are always biased because they try to show a positive view of themselves. So how valid can be the social network information?
Or when they do share this kind of information, the last thing they have in mind is that a recruiter will be evaluating this information. So, yeah, there are major ethical issues of how you use this information. Obviously, I hope that we will not end up in a day where people will be recruited only based on a chatbot or based on an analysis on profiling on their social media. But it's a challenge because there are so many data and so easily accessible from recruiters, which even if you are highly conscientious and you don't really want to get into trouble by visiting candidates' personal profiles, it's so easy that people are tempted very often. And if you are untrained or if you are easily influenced by negative information, whatever that is, yeah, this will have an impact on the selection process and the selection outcome.
Any questions from the audience? No? We can have one more question. How effective is data mining in selection and recruitment?
How effective it is?
Data mining.
Data mining. We don't know yet. I mean, as I said before, I'm involved in a project that will soon start with analyzing Glassdoor data. This data came on from guys in finance who said, look, we have so many data and we really don't know what they mean. Can you help us out here? I mean, what they might possibly measure or how they might be related to any, for example, interesting constructs for human resources management. So, I don't know. In terms of evidence, they're still very, very limited there. But there are many people who try to do things there. But as I said, in a data-driven approach rather than in a theoretical approach.
Okay. Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you very much.
Okay, continue with the session. Professor of a quite famous university, Catholic University of Leuven, which I really recommend you because it's a nice place. So if you are thinking about changing, you have to go to Leuven. He's one of the main authors, if not the most important in the field of job insecurity and employability. He belongs to WOP group in Leuven, and he's also in touch as an extraordinary professor with South Africa. You can approach while I'm telling you your profile. He has published several, as the rest of the authors, papers and books in important journals. And today Hans will try to answer an important question, and is whether job insecurity is a challenge or a hindrance for workers and organizations. So please give a huge welcome to Hans de Witte. Thank you, Hans. It's really easy.
Okay. Well, let me first start with two apologies. First, it's a bit a pity that I'm now presenting a presentation at 4 o'clock. This is lunchtime for most of you, or at least for those coming from the south. And second, I'm not having any reference to football in my presentation. I'm really very sorry for that. In fact, I was not aware of the big football match being here I've been here for 2 days in Madrid with my wife, so we went around on Saturday evening. It was slightly impossible to notice that there was a football match, because there were a lot of people referring to that, but I didn't know. Sorry. Anyway, so what would I like to discuss? So this is my menu of today. So I'd rather discuss a bit about job insecurity, tell you first what it is. I think it's interesting to define the concept before saying something about it. Then I will briefly say something about prevalence, so our people insecure or not, and about antecedents, so factors that might cause insecurity. And my biggest bit of the presentation today is about the consequences of insecurity for both individuals and organizations. And I use and I will explain that a bit in a while, I use the framework of a challenge and a hindrance stressor. So my main question here is it a challenge or is it a hindrance? And sometimes we will hear a lot about that in media or also in science, that people discuss and they say, well, perhaps insecurity is not such a bad thing. It might help people to perform or even outperform. And that's the thing I would like to discuss, perhaps also challenge today. Then at the end I will, and let's see whether I still have time, whether you still are awake. I would like to discuss a bit why does it have the consequences as it has, to become practical at the end and to say something about intervention. So what could we do? Is there anything we can do about insecurity? And that's a bit practical take-home message. And then, of course, at the end, scientists always want to know more, and we have been referring time and again also today to future research. I have some ideas about future research. Let's see whether we can get there. Okay, this is a cartoon I took from a colleague of mine, and it says, good news, your job-related stress problems will end today, you're fired. And I show you the cartoon simply to tell you that this is not about job insecurity. So what happens here is someone who is not insecure anymore, is secure about being fired. He lost a job. Which of course is a huge problem. It's about unemployment, but it's not about job insecurity. So let me explain what is job insecurity. It's a concept, as you could say, somewhere between work and unemployment. So I've been doing some research in the past, when I was very young, which is about 150 years ago, about unemployment and the consequences of unemployment. A lot of research has been done on that, and of course we know that unemployment is bad. Now we can also look at work, and there is a lot of work on job stress and the negative side of work, and here insecurity is a bit between. It's about an employee, and I give you 3 definitions, who might be insecure about the future, called here future permanence of the job. So subjective concerns about the fact that I will keep my job or not, or subjectively perceived likelihood of involuntary job loss, definition of my Swedish colleagues, Sverke et al., or, definition of myself it seems, perceived threat of job loss and the worries related to that threat. So it's all about, I'm having a job at the moment, but to a certain degree I fear that I might lose the job. And there are some core elements here that are worth explaining. First, of course, I'm a psychologist. You have to become something in life. I decided to be a psychologist after a while. And of course, psychologists focus on subjective things. So it's about perception, subjective perceptions of people regarding the jobs they're having at the moment. And of course, these subjective perceptions could be slightly, to a certain degree, different within a specific objective situation. So it could very well be that I'm interviewing someone and that this person feels insecure, whereas the other person in the same objective situation might not be that insecure. I will, of course, change this a bit later on in my presentation, because I'm not advocating here that insecurity is purely subjective and totally unrelated to reality. That is, of course, not what I wanted to say. But of course, but it does mean that it is about the individual having their own view on things happening. So that's one thing. It's subjective, and everyone more or less in the field would agree upon that part of the definition. Second part is a very important part. It's about what is insecurity really? Well, it's about uncertainty. It's not about certainty. It's not about the person we just saw in the cartoon who get to hear that the job has lost, that he is becoming unemployed. No, it's about uncertainty. You're kept into the dark. You do not know. You're uncertain. Perhaps tomorrow you might lose your job. But perhaps you might not. You might not even lose a job during your lifetime. So it's about something you are not aware of. You're aware of perhaps, but you're not certain of. And of course, it's something that might happen in the future. And the future could be tomorrow, could be next week, next month, once in a while, a lifetime. So the time span can, of course, be very short or very long. That very much depends. It's involuntary. It's not about something you chose, and you saw that already in the definition of my colleagues Sverke. There's kind of a difference between what I experience and what I would like to have. So it's there's kind of cleavage. I wrote here cleavage because I can't pronounce the word discrepancy very well, but the same thing anyway. And it's quantitative meaning, it's about the continuation of the job as such. If you want to put it into Shakespearean terms, it is to have a job or not to have a job. That's the logic. Sometimes they refer to this as the global or the overall concern. It's about I'm having a job or I might become unemployed. That's quantitative. Most research has been focused on quantitative job insecurity. There's also a bit of research lately, and it's growing, on qualitative job insecurity, and that is more about I'm not afraid that I might lose my job, but I'm not certain about the content of the job and the quality of the job. So I'm not going to lose the job, but I'm uncertain about the evolution of valued job features, which might disappear or not. So I'm not going to discuss this. Well, I have one slide, unfortunately, on that later on, but it's mainly on quantitative job insecurity, so it's about having a job or being dismissed. Now, this is late, and this is, of course, the moment to activate the audience a bit. I have two slides only on prevalence. Do workers feel insecure? So this is, of course, a rhetorical question. If nobody would feel insecure, then why bother to discuss this for an hour in this room? But then still, it could be that this is a majority feeling. Everyone perhaps became insecure, or at least a large group might become insecure. Or perhaps it could just be restricted to a smaller or a specific amount of workers. So it could be a minority. And so let's simply do the tests. Who think it is a majority of the workforce, let's say in Spain, who might feel insecure? Do raise your hand. There are hands to be seen. Great. Who thinks it's minority? A minority thinks it's a minority. Who doesn't think anything? Normally I also ask, who hasn't got a hand? Never anyone raises a hand, then wonder why. Well, oops, going the wrong side. I'm not sure you can see it very well. I hope you can. These are results reported not so long ago, but they are from 2004 and 2010, a variety of European countries. And the question they ask, and it's a very small one, you can't read it, I guess, is my job is secure. And they list here those who say it's not at all secure. So it's all those saying it's insecure. And you have those, well, you could say that the economic crisis was in between 2004 and 2010. That's after the latest economic crisis. And you see the increase or the decrease. But what I wanted to show you, and I'm not sure, oh, it's working, fantastic. It's about 16% at both times who said that they felt not at all secure, so who felt really insecure. And you can see the different countries. Spain's there, it was 11%, has been going up to 14%, so it has been increasing a bit, but still, at that time, of course, we're a bit later in time, that was a minority. Same happens, by the way, for Belgium, it's 10%. Netherlands, 13%. See, the people from the Netherlands are much more insecure than the Belgians. And you can see that there is, of course, a huge variety. It goes from 3 to 48%, and 48% here it was Slovakia. So my conclusion here would be it's a minority. It's a sizable minority because 16% of the European workforce, that's not, well, that's a huge amount of people, but still it's a minority. Then why? Why would people feel insecure? And I highlighted in my definition that it's a subjective thing. So it's a subjective perception of people. So Some people and some authors in the field, in the literature, do argue that it's all in the mind. It's all in the mind. It's subjective. It's very much related to personality, they would say. Others would say, no, it's rooted in reality. It reflects the objective labor market position of an individual or of specific groups. And of course, again, now I can do my question, or I can raise my question to you. Who thinks it is mostly a subjective thing, not really related that much to reality? Please raise your hands. Ha, one brave person. Someone has to do it. Good. Then who says it's a more reflection of an objective reality? Okay, and who's not thinking anything? Good. Always some brave do not think anything. So this is an overview of results. And yet, indeed, of course, it is subjective, so it's also related to personality traits. Like it's related to an internal locus of control. Those with an internal locus of control tend to perceive less insecurity. Those with negative affectivity, those who perceive negative emotions around them in almost anything they experience, they have a higher level of insecurity. So yes, there's correlations with personality, but this is not just the only story to be told. It's not just personality. Correlations are around 0.30, something like that, so it's there, but this is not the main issue. It's very much related to objective individual labor market characteristics, such as blue-collar workers. It's a bit difficult, perhaps, to argue that blue-collar workers are higher on insecurity simply because they have the wrong personality. Low-skilled workers, people working in industry, temporary workers, sometimes scholars even use the temporary contract as an indicator of insecurity. So all these aspects are clearly strongly correlated with insecurity, and they point towards the fact that people with a weak or a disadvantaged, if you wish, position on the labor market tend to score higher on insecurity. At the same time, you also find that it's related to structural aspects of the labor market, like if you compare countries, if we saw that in Slovakia, level was about half of them saying that they were insecure. It's not about their personalities, I guess, but it's about the fact that the labor market at that time in Slovakia was quite bad. And so it does reflect the unemployment level, it does reflect the economic situation of a country, of a region, and so on. So again, subjective does not mean unrelated to reality. It really reflects the objective position of someone in the labor market. Now, that were just the starting up issues. Now I would like to discuss the consequences of job insecurity. And you could have the debate as whether it's a good or a bad thing. I could, of course, ask you, but it's there already to a certain degree. And you could look at individual health and well-being, or you could look at organizational things. And sometimes if you look at media, or if you read things in the media, in the literature as well, people raise the idea that insecurity might be a positive thing. It could be a challenge rather than a hindrance. It could mobilize energy. Perhaps people would be more creative, more productive if they're insecure. And what I would like to do with you today, and that's the biggest part of my presentation, is to look at the evidence and to see whether we can find traces of those ideas if we look at health and well-being, if we look at stuff like organizational attitudes and productivity. And I follow this framework that perhaps many of you might know, the framework about challenge versus hindrance stressors. Now, what did they show here? This is the work of Crawford and Lepine and others. You, of course, have resources. We all know what resources are. This is the positive things in the work. And we have two outcome variables here, burnout and work engagement. And what is typical for resources? Well, they decrease burnout and they increase engagement. So resources are the good bits in the work. They are the positive aspects. Okay? And next to resources, we of course have demands. And demands, they argue, could be two different things, at least. Or one could make the distinction between hindrance demands and challenge demands. Now, hindrance demands are simply the opposite as resources. Hindrance demands, as the name says, it's something that is associated with burnout, so something very bad, and negatively associated with work engagement. So this is bad. I mean, if you have a lot of hindrance demands, this will make you feel bad. However, the challenge demands, they have a kind of ambivalent reaction. The challenge demands, they are associated with burnout, but at the same time, and perhaps even a bit more, with engagement. So they have a good and a bad side at the same time. So they take away energy, they exhaust you, but at the same time, perhaps also mobilize you or energize you. And my question here is, now I'm going to look at the literature, and I'm going to see what are the consequences of job insecurity. Are they mixed, or are they negative, or are they positive? And that will help me to decide whether it's a challenge, a hindrance, or perhaps even a resource. So let's look at individual health and well-being. And I'm a psychologist, so I start with the bad side, of course. There's a lot of evidence here showing that insecurity is associated with a lot of bad things. And I list here things going from well-being to health. So there is a lot of evidence showing that it's associated with burnout or exhaustion, with anxiety, depression, if you go outside the work situation, with blood pressure, which goes up. And there is even research of psychiatrists, I'm still not managing this very well, it seems, of psychiatrists, who shows that it's associated with the occurrence of heart diseases on the long term. Now, I'm not advocating here that job insecurity is the most important factor increasing heart diseases. That would be perhaps a bit strange. But if you single out the impact of job insecurity and you control it for all the other known predictors of heart diseases, then it still has a positive impact on heart diseases. Rather difficult to say that this is a positive thing. So insecurity seems to be associated with an increase of negative health and well-being indicators. Okay, but that's one side. What about the other side? Does it also have positive well-being outcomes? Well, if we look at the good side, then job insecurity is clearly associated with lower work engagement, lower job satisfaction, lower life satisfaction, lower mental and physical health. So if you look at the positive side, then the picture is very clear as well. It's associated with a decrease of positive health indicators. So the positive and the negative side seem to go together and show that it's a bad thing. There is a bit of, at a certain point in time, I had the possibility to do an overview of longitudinal studies. And of course, what I presented you, it's about associations, correlations, and anyone in the room would then tell me, well, we don't know what is causing what. So, okay, let's look at longitudinal evidence. And the interesting bit is that there were much more studies, longitudinal studies, than I thought there were. I thought there were going to be about 10, 15, the ones I could recall out of memory. There seems to be about 60 studies at that time, and they allowed me to compare at least 3 kinds of causation. So you have the logic as to its insecurity causing health and well-being problems. It could be reversed. It could be health and well-being causing insecurity, or it could be reciprocal, meaning that it could be both. Now, if you look at the evidence, it's really almost exclusively normal causation. So about all studies testing for normal causation do found normal causation. There were not that many studies testing reversed or reciprocal, but those who did also almost all found normal causation. So there is quite a lot of evidence, I think, to say that it's insecurity causing the negative outcomes. Now, I have another one. Sometimes in the literature you get this argument. Okay, perhaps it's bad for workers, for the employees. But what about the entrepreneurs? You know, the entrepreneurs, those are those who really perhaps transform insecurity into some challenge, stressor, and get motivated because of insecurity. Why? Well, insecurity is simply being assumed very often to be the core of economy and to really steer economy and economical behavior. So, okay, let's test that. If it works, yes. I was able to sample about 1,000 self-employed and entrepreneurs at a certain point in time. And of course, I can't ask them about insecurity about their jobs because they don't have a job, they have a business. But then we transform the scale a bit, and it's about insecurity about losing the business in the short term. And what do we see? Well, you find exactly the same results. And this is quite striking, I think. So those who feel insecure also feel exhausted, but they also feel less vital as one of the aspects of work engagement. So it really shows the same results as the employees. And when I once presented this to the entrepreneurs, I told them, see, entrepreneurs are people after all. They were not pleased with this comment, probably because of me. Anyway, job insecurity seems to be clearly a hindrance stressor, I think, causing burnout, decreasing work engagement. So if you look at well-being, the situation or the picture is quite clear. Okay, I present this and then I get a slightly cynical comment perhaps from an employer who says, okay, big deal, it's bad for workers, but that's not really my issue as long as it motivates them and makes them work harder, perform better. So if it's got the positive organizational consequences, could still be a challenge stressor then, and that's what some employers might want. So okay, let's put this to the test as well and look at attitudes and look at behaviors, but first I will have a sip of water. Attitudes. Well, if you list all attitudes I've seen, of research on attitudes I've seen so far, and there are some very interesting meta-analysis as well, you see that the attitudes or the associations of insecurity with attitudes are negative as well. Okay? It's associated with low job involvement, reduced motivation, with a very low score on effective organizational commitment, less support for goals, but then look at this one, I found this very interesting. Trust is very strongly negatively correlated with insecurity. So the biggest effect you find on something measured is especially on organizational attitudes. Trust really goes down when people feel insecure. And also they tend to be negative towards organizational change, or when some kind of organizational change is happening, this might increase the resistance against organizational change, which of course is a very important finding, because organizational change tend to increase insecurity. And if insecurity then turns against organizational change by resistance, then you get into a possible negative spiral or cycle. Okay, what about behaviors? Again, you could say attitudes are bad. No, who cares? What about the behaviors? Well, you could make the distinction based on the worker spectrum between the good and the bad ones. If you look at behaviors, the good ones are the productive behaviors, those who are in line with the description of the function and the organization. So if I'm a post-delivery person and I really deliver post, that's productive work, I guess. And counterproductive work is everything you do that might go against. If I throw away my post, then that's counterproductive behavior. It could also be absenteeism, could also be turnover. Those are counterproductive behavior, not necessarily because I want to retaliate against the organization, but simply because when I'm ill or when I leave, the work is not done. And that's not productive in the formal sense. So let's look at the productive side. This time, well, again, the picture is quite clear. I find negative associations with a large variety of productive behaviors. If you look at in-role behaviors, really doing the performance you are supposed to do, then you really find meta-analytical results showing that there is lower performance. People who feel insecure perform less well. And I also tested this among my entrepreneurs, because you could then expect, well, for the entrepreneurs, perhaps that might be different. But no, for them as well, it was negative. We find a negative correlation, beta of minus 0.16. If you look at the OCBs, the extra role behavior, so going the extra mile, doing something additional that you're not necessarily supposed to do, here again, you find a reduction. And in recent work, we try to extend this towards innovative work behavior or creativity or implementation of creative thoughts. And again, we find negative signs. And I was at a conference last year where my Swedish colleagues presented some work, meta-analytical work on innovative work behavior, on the associations with behaviors. And a bit surprising was that they showed the highest negative correlations with innovative work behavior, whereas in the work that I've been involved in, it's always negative, but it's perhaps not that strong as an effect, but still. So no positive signs. What about causality? Well, I have a small scoop, perhaps, a paper that has been revised and resubmitted very recently, showing this. We have a measure of qualitative job insecurity, so it's not quantitative but qualitative insecurity. It's about being insecure about valuable job features. We measured them 3 times, 6 months in between. We have performance, in-role performance, and you see that insecurity decreases performance, and if my performance is lower, then my insecurity will go up, or turn the other way around. If my performance is high, my insecurity will go down. But the interesting bit is, so there is a two-sided effect, so it's reciprocal, but it forms a kind of negative cycle or a negative spiral. It's not a positive one. It's not because I'm insecure, I will work harder and that will reduce my insecurity. No, it's because I'm insecure that I will work less hard, my in-role performance will go down, and that will in turn increase my insecurity. And you get into kind of negative spiral or cycle. What about the counterproductive behaviors? Well, it's the other side. You find more turnover behavior. Meta-analysis showing a very clear correlation, negative or a positive correlation, meaning that people who are insecure, they tend to leave. And a typical finding already from a long time ago is that those who have the strongest labor market position tend to leave sooner. So those who have the best position want to leave the company the moment they feel insecure. Why? Well, they think, because I've got good labor market capacities, I might easily find another job somewhere else, and I'd rather leave this sinking boat than being on this boat and being into the water and then having to find another boat afterwards. But that's, of course, a problem, a big problem for organizations. Absenteeism goes up. There's a lot of interesting work of the higher Probst in the United States showing, and I just list one of their studies, that safety goes down, so people are less motivated and take more risks, so more injuries and accidents might happen when you're insecure. And especially because Alfredo has been doing a lot of work on mobbing, I added at least 3 papers on mobbing, so there's also an association with mobbing or bullying at work. One is that in one study with Hinootelaars, we used a large set of job characteristics and we simply regressed them on mobbing to find out that insecurity was one of the significant ones. And recently there is an overview a systematic overview of literature showing that there are 5 job characteristics typically associated with mobbing at work, and insecurity is one of those. Then it's associated not just with being the target. It's not because you become the target of mobbing because you might feel insecure, because your position perhaps becomes weaker, but it's also associated with becoming the perpetrator. You might start mobbing others because you feel insecure. And in another study with Elfie Bayer, we found out that organizational restructuring is associated with mobbing. So in a context of restructuring, there might be more mobbing or bullying, and that's partly, not just only, but partly related to the fact that in this restructuring, people are more insecure, and that might in turn then lead to more mobbing. And there's a recent paper that we got published of Elfie with a 3-wave longitudinal research in work and stress, showing more or less the same, but in a much more extended and more refined way than this. Okay, so my conclusion here, if you want to look at the organizational side, well, insecurity is also a hindrance stressor regarding the attitudes towards the organization. They're bad, they're negative. Regarding the behaviors, there's less positive behaviors, people perform less good, there's more negative behaviors, so there's more counterproductive behaviors. And in short, you could say that there are no signs of what in a recent, for those who know the literature in a recent overview of Schoss, was called the job preservation motivation. So she advocated that, yes, it's negative, but perhaps it could also be positive. People could perhaps want to perform stronger in order to preserve their jobs. Well, that's not what we find if you look at the literature. So it's quite clearly negative. Now, I still have 10 minutes, I see. In these 10 minutes, I would like to do 2 things. besides zipping. Perhaps it's interesting for a short while to discuss why. So it's bad. Insecurity is bad, but why? Why is it bad? What kind of theories can explain the negative consequences of insecurity? And the second one, of course, is becoming a bit more practical. What can we do? If you look at the explanation, well, I'm listing three theories here. The very famous Yahoda framework, the latent deprivation model, is developed to explain unemployment, but it could be used here. Then you could look at job stress theory, and you could look at psychological contract theory. The three of them have been used quite a lot lately in explaining insecurity, and it's only three, because you could really highlight much more theories, and lately the amount of theories is really increasing, even though it seems to be, it was more or less an ignored issue in research, but it's a bit growing, which is a good thing. So one thing is the latent deprivation model of Yahoda. I'm not sure whether you ever heard of the Maria Yahoda's latent deprivation model. It's a model developed quite more than 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, to explain why unemployment is such a problem. And the logic here was that, well, unemployment is a problem because work is the key to social integration and social participation. People satisfy a lot of important needs by working. It gives you an income, it gives you the possibility for social contacts, to develop your skills, to get recognized, to get status, and so on. And so if for the first time we meet and I need to say who I am, I might not refer to my very obscure musical taste, which is extremely important for my social identity, but I will refer to the fact that I'm a professor at the university working on work psychology kind of topics. So work is important to define identity. And the logic here is that, well, the prospect that you might lose this key aspect that might integrate you in society is, of course, not a nice thing. And this is frightening, and this might perhaps explain lots of the negative consequences. That's one thing. If you go a bit more strictly to the work domain, you could use some of the job stress theory aspects. Insecurity is a stressor, and there's a lot of ways of looking at stressors, but one thing is that if you look at Peter Ward's vitamin model, two aspects of job stress might be relevant. It's about unpredictability. If you do not know what will happen to you, then this unpredictability is a negative thing, and insecurity is exactly about unpredictability. But even more than unpredictability, perhaps it's also about uncontrollability. Many times people who are insecure do not know what to do in order to control this. It's something that happens because they will close down a firm, the total firm, or someone somewhere else in the United States decided to close down a firm, or the economic situation is turning in a bad way and people will lose jobs. So it's very often uncontrollable. And of course we know that unpredictability and above all uncontrollability is a negative thing. And so that might of course explain why insecurity is a bad thing. It could also relate to psychological contract theory, and I guess most of you know that. You could say that in the traditional employer-employee relationship, the logic is that me as an employee, I offer to do my best. I'm offering effort and loyalty. And in exchange, you as an employer, you will offer me a good income and security, and that's part of the traditional deal. And the traditional deal is, as I can refer to research on that, is still very dominant, at least in Europe. This is the dominant way of looking at the employer-employee relationship. Now, of course, insecurity will be perceived as a violation of this agreement, of this contract, and that leads to lots of negative consequences, not just well-being consequences, but also organizational consequences, as I might want to do less in order to restore the balance. You, as an employer, you're not giving me what I'm entitled to. Well, I'm, of course, not giving you what you might be entitled to in order to restore my balance. So that's three ways of explaining. There's more, I guess. As I only got 5 minutes, I need to say something about what to do now. So, okay, it's a problem. We can explain it. What could we suggest to people in practice in order to deal with insecurity? It's a big problem. And we have to become very practical. But there is not a lot of research on this kind of intervention. There's not a lot we know. There is a bit, but not a lot. And I think that it would be interesting to look back at the explanation and to use the explanations, that's why I did highlight some of them, in order to develop an intervention. And looking back at the explanation, and I only now highlight one of the possible explanations, the one related to control. And the logic here again is insecurity is a problem because it relates to the lack of control. Many people do not feel they can control what happens to them. They cannot do a lot. And that's, of course, what makes it problematic. And you could relate that to the appraisal theory of Lazarus and Folkman. The primary appraisal is there a problem? Is there a threat? Yes, I feel a threat. I feel insecure. And then the secondary appraisal is, okay, is there anything I can do to control that? And if there isn't, that's, of course, bad. Now, my logic here is that you could perhaps develop interventions to reduce insecurity, but you could also develop interventions to buffer its negative consequences. So there is a double road to be taken. You could reduce insecurity by increasing the control over the situation. So some variables might be antecedents of insecurity, and others might, I shouldn't point towards that because you don't see that, might buffer the negative consequences of insecurity. So we could work on antecedents, we could work on moderators. And my idea here is that 4 variables might have both effects. And these are communication, participation, employability, and aspects of justice. So these 4 relate to control. And if you increase them, you increase control. That might mean that you might have less insecurity and that you might buffer its negative consequences. And now I have a slide for those who need visualization. I learned that my students sometimes don't like it that much if you just explain it in words, so they want to see the figures and the arrows. So here they are. So these 4 relate to control, and they might reduce insecurity, and at the same time, insecurity is negative, might also buffer its negative consequences. Now, I don't know whether you can see it here, you can't. There is a very strange thing in my slides. It's here somewhere, there is a small arrow appearing. I don't know where it is. And it's gone here. This is even more strange. It's fantastic. I mean, I should present my things in Spain more often. It's gone. It's really gone. It was there in the morning. It still was. Okay. First word. Reduce job insecurity. So what can you do? You can, of course, it's about, I do not know what will happen. If you communicate better about what will happen and when it will happen, this, of course, might reduce to a certain degree insecurity because you take out some insecurity. I'm not advocating that you will take out all insecurity, but it might reduce a bit. You can, of course, allow people to participate, and of course, it is more to be said than just this, but well, for the limited time, I can refer to those. Participation is about people telling to the organization or changing to a certain degree the activity of the organization, telling the organization, well, I would like you to do this or do that and take my ideas into account. Research of, among others, Tyra Probst showed that participation might also, to a certain degree, reduce insecurity. Why? Because people who communicate or get communication or are able to participate, they, of course, can control to a certain degree what happens to them, and that increases predictability. Now, employability is a third one. It's about the subjective perception of the possibility to achieve a new job, to get a new job. A lot of research on employability is about I have the capacity to get another job. Now, of course, if you feel employable, that might decrease insecurity because you think, well, anyway, I might get another job anyway. And then organizational justice is, of course, a very broad theoretical framework. It relates to the fact that procedures are followed. If they are followed, things get slightly more predictable and controllable, I guess. about the distribution of the end results. It's about, well, something bad is happening, but the act of the organization is proportional to the problem. If there is not a lot of problem in the organization and they suddenly start dismissing a lot of persons working there, there's kind of discrepancy between what happens and the way they react. So distributive injustice is that it's not proportional. That, of course, increases the fact that it's less controllable. Now, the research suggests that the 4 of them indeed do increase predictability and controllability and might be linked with the reduction of insecurity. So that as antecedents, they might work. Second road, perhaps the same 4 might also be able to reduce, cushion, as they sometimes say, the negative consequences of insecurity. And the logic here is that if you have a high level of control, the association between insecurity and outcomes might be less strong, whereas if you're low in control, then it might have a stronger effect, so it's less of a problem when you have control. And again, indeed, research shows that the 4 that I listed thus far, communication, participation, employability, and justice, also trust in management, that's kind of subdimension of organizational justice, might indeed do that. It might indeed help you to buffer the negative consequences. So I have 4 stones here that might help you to do something with the insecurity issue. Okay, in my last minute, which I haven't, I might just say this. There's more to be said. Of course, researchers will always tell you there is more research needed on the topic. Of course, that's what they do. But there is at least 3 things, and if any one of you would like to do research on that, there is at least 3 roads you could take here. One is that you could broaden the focus, and recently, with many others, people are trying to compare countries. So perhaps the impact of insecurity might be different in different countries or different cultures. And that's an interesting way of broadening our topic, and it ties in with one of the questions raised in the morning. Second one is we might want to gain more in-depth knowledge. That is, mainly, we might try to explain the consequences of insecurity in a better way by using longitudinal research. And then, of course, above all, perhaps we need to become practical and develop and test interventions in which we try to reduce insecurity and try to increase ways to cope with that. I'm sorry I exceeded my time with 3 minutes.
Okay. We have several questions in online. I will transmit some of them because I guess that I can summarize some questions. Is job security or insecurity an important concept in this reality, or is outdated?
I don't think it's outdated at all. I mean, if I feel bad, if my health goes down, if my performance goes down, then you can say it's an outdated concept, but still my health and my performance goes down. So I don't follow the logic as to whether that might be outdated. I think that we, as psychologists, need to analyze those concepts that have consequences for individuals and organizations. And by showing the results I showed, I think I just did so.
How to distinguish between challenge and hindrance demands? Some keys about this?
Well, one way, there's many ways of trying to do that. One way is looking at the consequences. Looking at the associations or the long-term associations, as I try to show on my slide. So if you have consistently negative consequences or ambivalent consequences, that might be a way of making a distinction. Yeah? Sometimes people also try to analyze it in a different way and go for appraisals of demands. So you could also ask people whether a specific situation is more a challenge for them as an appraisal or more a hindrance of them as an appraisal. And there is a bit of research on that. It's a bit more difficult to do that, and it's perhaps also a possible way of doing it. But I've been showing results of the first road.
Do employees react to job insecurities with reduced effort? I think one of your studies showed this.
Yes.
So is this just reciprocity back in time? I mean, as they don't have security, they are going to work less? Is something like that?
Well, I think you can partly explain it that way, that people retaliate, that they, in a psychological contract, so there's many ways of explaining it, but psychological contract theory would then state, because I don't feel treated correctly, I will not give you what you're entitled to, because I didn't get what I'm entitled to, and that might explain. But there is many other ways of explaining a reduction of performance as well. You could also refer to the job stress theory, saying, well, it takes a lot of energy to deal with insecurity, and that takes away of energy you could have put in doing your job. Because now you're afraid, you're losing time over worrying, you start rumination, emotions make you make mistakes, all of that is lost energy and lost effort, I guess. And it's just two of the possible ways of explaining it, I guess.
Okay. Questions from the audience? Yeah, Arnold.
Very nice overview. I have a question. Is low job insecurity, is that the same as high security? Is it the key resource if you know that you will have your job in 5 years?
It's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure it's been solved at the moment yet. So this research thus far seems to suggest that both might be the opposite side of the same concept, but I think there is not a lot of research on the impact of security as such, but a lot on insecurity, even though at the origins of this kind of research tradition, people have been framing it in a positive way. So the original research on insecurity was, for about a decade, research on security and its motivating potential. So, but it could, I know that within the job demand resources model, security and insecurity sometimes have been used in a different way. Sometimes it was security a resource, sometimes insecurity a demand. But that's perhaps one of the issues we need to analyze further.
And could it be a follow-up question? Could it be that older workers are looking for security, whereas younger workers may react more favorable to job insecurity in this new gig economy?
Yeah, I know that this is the classical question I get, so this is an old school question almost, rather than a new school. I don't believe it that much, to be honest. If I look at research among young people, then I've rarely found a study in which young people state that insecurity is totally irrelevant for them. Not so long ago, in Belgium at least, we had a very huge study about young people and their attitudes toward work and their expectations. And it's very interesting to see that the fact to have a secure job is still listed as one of the most prominent aspects of a job, which is a kind of extrinsic aspect, but it's very prominently there still. So I think that we sometimes mistakenly think that everyone is as we are. And we look at very highly skilled young people, which is of course a small bit of the total amount of people working there, and some of them for a specific time, a specific period in time, might perhaps not find that the most important thing to focus on, even though that might change later on. So, well, I'm reluctant to think that there is a huge age difference, or at least research didn't show it that much.
Maybe the students want to tell us something about if they want a secure position or not. I'm afraid that I know the answer. More questions?
Oh, we can do the raise your hands thing. Who wants an insecure job?
Yes, Abril.
Thank you very much, Hans, for the really very, very good presentation. So giving the overview and convincingly showing the associations with the negative outcomes. But I still have a similar question like Arnold. Despite these overall negative outcomes, can we imagine people for whom maybe job insecurity is not a big issue? I mean, it seems not to be age, but what are your thoughts about that?
Mm, yeah, well, of course we can imagine that. I mean, this is a overview of the large picture. I've been showing research on unemployment, and on average, unemployment is clearly negative for the majority of people. But within that total group, you can also find a small group in which unemployment might be experienced in a different way, perhaps even for a specific amount of time, giving them possibilities to develop a way they couldn't develop in the past. So yes, there might be a minority on, as long as we acknowledge that this is a minority. The whole debate very often has been rephrased as to it's the majority, this is how it is. And I don't like that much, as it is simply contradictory to findings. But yes, there might be a minority, and one of the debates lately is explicitly to try to find that. What kind of moderators might turn insecurity into a more motivating thing, even though it might only be for a very small group. I agree. Thus far, I must say, I haven't been finding a lot. You find lots of moderators that might decrease the impact of insecurity, perhaps even cancel it out. But turning it into a positive thing, I've not seen that much, or at all, to be honest. But yeah, it's possible.
Last two questions before we leave.
I hope to have a new school question. And that is, I was not surprised that you found that only 16% of the European workforce is high on insecurity. And one of the reasons for me to think that it would be low is that if you know that you will lose your job, you're no longer insecure. So, does security, does knowing for sure that you will lose your job, does that mean that insecurity loses its unfavorable effect?
That's a great question. It's almost a conceptual, philosophical question almost, and it's been there in the literature of insecurity from the start. It's a bit difficult. I sometimes think that we scientists have a more refined way of looking at these distinctions, whereas if you simply ask someone who is experiencing this, the distinction between, well, I'm insecure about losing my job, no, because I lost it, but I'm insecure about the rest of my life, which is perhaps a bigger kind of insecurity, it's mixed much more in reality than in our refined, scientific, sophisticated heads, I might say. So it's difficult to answer the question, to be honest. I think that most people, even though they know they will lose their job, might say, well, perhaps I'm not insecure about this job, but I'm now really insecure about my further work position and my life, which is perhaps even more devastating.
But well, you said that it was again an old school question, but I don't believe it, because you propose a model including communication, including participation, including fairness, probably also procedural fairness, which all seems to suggest that as long as you tell people that they will lose their job, and you get them included and participating in the decisions about losing jobs and taking away jobs, that may ameliorate the effect of job insecurity on strain. That was your model, right?
It's not just a model, it's also empirically proven.
So that means that, in my view, that would imply that knowing that you will lose reduces the effect of the psychology of being insecure.
Well, to a certain...
So it's not so philosophical.
I think it's to a certain degree also true. We've been doing quite a lot of research on temporary workers, and insecurity among temporary workers still has a negative effect, but much less strongly so as compared to permanent workers, and that might relate to the fact that their psychological contract might be slightly more different, or that they were perhaps not expecting insecurity at the beginning. So yes, I think it might reduce, but what I'm saying is that this kind of almost sophistic way of thinking, I'm not saying sophisticated, but sophistic way of thinking about insecurity might be a conceptual way of doing it for scientists, and for people, reality might feel less nice. But yeah, I do buy the argument.
I think that you are going to get used, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to have an effect. Because at the end, it's going to be a huge problem for everyone, but still, in somehow, it will have an impact on you, although it's a problem for all of us. It's going to affect of all of us at the same time. So I guess that people can get used to, but as you have shown in your presentation, is still going to have an impact on individual well-being and health. So I think that will be probably the point.
Could you compare this with the situation that, let's say, a partner is taking care of his wife, or a woman is taking care of her husband, and the person is sick for 5 years and has a chronic disease, will for sure die, but you don't know how long it will take. And then the person dies, so the insecurity is gone, but then there is a kind of relief. This is what I mean, this phenomenon. Do you see this also in job insecurity research?
Yes, but this is really something else. We know that prolonged insecurity is almost unbearable, and that people, after a period of very prolonged insecurity, where they get to know that they might lose their job, this actually, for a short time, increases their well-being. Because now, suddenly, the situation becomes controllable. You know what will happen, you know what you can do. You can start grieving, you can start preparing for the future, and so on. Yes, I think that prolonged insecurity, it, again, highlights the importance of security over insecurity. Prolonged insecurity is really unbearable, it seems. And that's what you hear when you hear people interviewed at a factory that is closed down. After long periods of insecurity, people say, I don't like it, but at least now I know what will happen. Yeah.
What a positive message for closing this day of seminar. Okay, I hope that we can meet all together tomorrow here in the seminar. It will be even better than today if this is possible, so I hope to see you here in the room. See you tomorrow. Bye.